Hi everyone, I'm Jaden and I'm from Boycott Academy.
I'm Vianne from Milani High School.
And I am Quintin, and I'm also from Hawaii Baptist Academy.
My name is Jesse. I'm from Hawaii High School.
And today we are presenting our work at the Biosensing Lab. We'll have a brief overview of what we've been doing for the past 6 weeks, and we'll dive into some basic concepts behind our lab. We'll show you guys 2 projects that we worked on, as well as a special third project that we designed ourselves. We'll talk about some problems that we've encountered, and finally our conclusions.
So just as a quick overview of our lab, our mentors were Mohammad and Samira. The principal investigators of our lab was Dr. Olga and Dr. Victor, and we are part of the Biosensing Vitals lab. Basically, we're looking for ways to detect a person's heart rate and respiratory rate using non-invasive and non-contact methods.
So once again, our aim was to provide a contactless way to detect a person's respiratory rate. And this is important because we might not be able to always put patients on or put a sensor on somebody. And this may be true in people like newborn children who may not be comfortable with that sort of contact yet, or infected patients who it wouldn't be optimal to be in close proximity to them, or burn patients whose skin is, it's not ideal to put any sensors on their skin. And so going with the current technology, what we have is optical infrared light cameras, or reflection LED-based head pulse sensors, or spirometers. And the problem with these things and many others is that there's limited mobility. They're very obtrusive. So as you can see that picture in the middle, that individual hooked up to all those wires and sensors. And they're also very expensive to install and work. And this is why our lab is important, and our objective is to make sure we can eliminate those problems.
Alright, so the process of our lab is that we would start taking test trials at different parameters, and then we would also do data collection on those test trials. And we would accomplish this by using 2 antennas, which we'll get to later. We'll explain all of this later too. And our mechanical mover, which you can see in the picture on the right. And then our antennas use the Doppler effect. And we also use continuous waves, which is a radar type. And some other hardwares that we have are mixers, low noise amplifiers, splitters, phase shifters, and low pass filters. And so how does the antenna work? It is a 2.4 gigahertz continuous wave quadrature channel Doppler radar. So that means on the top right, you can see the 2 antennas, and then we use those to see time and range of movement using the mover on the bottom. So the video, that is an example of our mover. So all it really does is move back and forth, and we can control that using a program. And it pretty much just simulates a human torso in a controlled environment.
Earlier, Quintin mentioned the Doppler effect, which is a crucial part of our lab. So the Doppler effect describes how, as an object moves, it describes how a wave's frequency fluctuates as it hits a moving target. So as an object moves towards the source of a wave, then when the wave gets reflected back, then it'll oscillate at a higher frequency. But as an object moves away from a wave, when it gets reflected back, it'll oscillate at a lower frequency. And by studying how the frequency of a wave changes, that's how we determine how an object is moving.
So this is just a quick overview of the different softwares and technologies that we used. So one of the things that we used was VS Code. This was used to basically send out signals from the radar. And we used GDK, which basically sets the amplitude and frequency of the mover. This would allow us to simulate the inhale and exhale of a human breath. And after we use both those softwares, we would go into Google Collaboratory, where we develop programs and different functions to analyze our data. So in terms of the type of wave that we used continuous waves, and basically this would make it so that there's constant power flowing through, so the amplitude and frequency would stay at a constant rate, allowing us to collect data in a more precise environment, and it's also much more cost-effective considered to other waves, and it's also very easy to analyze the post-process data.
So now we're going to move on to our first objective, which was data acquisition. And this objective included radar calibration and data taking. And we did this in 3 steps. Our first step was to just get acquainted with the radar technology. Our second step was to take data from various types of movements to prepare for human data. And our third step was to take said human data.
So the general process of collecting data is the 4 steps here. So step number 1 is to set the amplitude and frequency of a mock torso, and that was using the GDK software as discussed earlier. The second step is to run the program in VS Code. This would send out the continuous waves and allow us to collect the data. And step number 2 and 3 are kind of combined together, where we run the program in VS Code, and this would give us the I graph, the Q graph, and a graph that combines both elements, the Q graph. Those graphs can be seen on the pictures on the right over there. And step number 4 would be save all the files, so that way we can post-process in Google Collaboratory.
So now our first experiment was called radar calibration test. Basically, this is 26 data sets at various parameters. And the point of this was just general standard movement of the mover. So the mover would just move back and forth at a set amplitude and frequency. And it would mimic a real life chest. And this is because we set the maximum amplitude of the mover to be 1 centimeter. And this matched the maximum human chest expansion of 1.2 centimeters. And basically the point of this step was just to acclimate us to working with the technology and getting used to the data collection process. And as you can see on the top right photo, that's us in process of taking our data set. And those 3 images on the bottom are just some of the technology that we got from familiarized with. And that table on the top left is just the different variables that we set our mover to. The images below that is just all the files that we ended up taking. And the image on the right is just what one of those individual files looks like on the inside.
Before we move on to our next experiment, I'll explain the pertinent issue. So we have 2 channels called the I channel and the Q channel. They both transmit and receive radio waves. But they're phase shifted in such a way that when one channel has their optimum point, as Quintin will explain later, another has their null point. And also, they also have 2 different pairs of mixers and 2 different pairs of low noise amplifiers. And that causes variations in the amplitude and the phase shiftedness between the 2 samples. So if we process the 2 channels together without doing the balance correction, then we'll get an ellipse-like figure as shown in the graph above the blue part, and we want a circle. Also, there's going to be extra frequencies that we don't want. So that's why we need to do the balance correction.
So the experiment that we paired with that issue for imbalance correction was we just set them into a high peak to peak amplitude of 4 centimeters. And the reasoning behind this is that using a higher amplitude for our mover gives us a bigger arc. And as you can see on that image on the left, using a 0.6 centimeter amplitude for our mover gave us only a tiny portion of our arc. But using the 4 centimeter amplitude, as you can see on the right image, we get a larger, more pronounced circle. And this just gives us a larger amount of data and gives us more numbers to use to calculate the difference between those 2 channels with imbalance correction. And the good thing about this is that because it's a hardware issue, the difference between those 2 channels is constant, and we can apply it to all further tests.
Alright, so like how Jaden mentioned before, our radar system does have null and optimum points. So that means there are certain distances that give better data than others. So in the next slide, we have our experiment, which is the step movement. And so this means that we would program our mover to go to a certain X position, and it should oscillate sinusoidally for a certain amount of time, which was like around 15 seconds, and then it would go into another X position and repeat that process. And so we wanted to do this, or we performed this experiment to see how the signal would behave at different distances. And then this was also to help find the null and optimum points.
And then our 4th experiment was just the effect of radar cross-section on radar signals. And radar cross-section is just the area that is getting reflected back to us by our signals. So it's kind of just like the size of the subject that's in front of the antennas. And what we did for this one is that we replaced the foil torso with metal spheres of 3 different radii. So those would be 5 centimeters, 7.5 centimeters, and 10.4 centimeters. And we just ran each size with the mover at 0.2 hertz and 0.5 hertz of frequency. And as you can see on the top right image, that's just what one of the spheres looks like. And looking at the graph below that, the 3 different sizes create 3 different graphs, and they're on different levels on this graph. And this basically just tells us that our signal does in fact differ when we're presented with different size subjects. And this applies to taking real data with humans because individuals aren't the same size, they aren't the same shape. So this would help create a better, robust system that can get used to the differences in people. And just to summarize all the things we did, so imbalance was just calculating the difference between the I and Q channels due to the mixers. The step movement was just to see how our signals behave at different distances. And the metal spheres were just testing spheres at different radii to see how the radar cross-section affects our data.
So experiment number 5 was done taking actual human data. So before this, we were doing everything based off of a mock torso. So that means we were basically simulating a computer-generated thing where we're kind of like duplicating a person inhaling and exhaling when they're breathing. So now we have an actual human subject breathing in front of the radar, so that way we can get more realistic sets of data. So in this case, on the picture over there, you can see one of our subjects sitting in front of the radar, and they're breathing at a constant rate of 14 and 15 beats per minute. This was measured using a metronome app, and basically, like I said, it allowed us to collect more realistic data, and the graphs on the bottom right is what we got.
So after we finished all of our experiments, we went into Google Colab and coded post-processing algorithms using Python. The method of post-processing that we use is called arctangent demodulation. That sounds complicated, but it's a fancy way of saying now we took our I and our Q channel signals. We graphed them on our I versus Q chart, and we took each data point and we took the angle between the data points and the x-axis about the origin. The first step of arctangent demodulation is called circle fitting, where we literally fit a circle to our data. Next, we do DC offset computation, which means that we move our data to the origin, like in the orange data represented in the left. We do this because if we don't move the data to the origin, then you can see there's small crests and troughs in the bottom right graph. It's not a clean sine wave, and the DC offset fixes that problem. Next is unwrapping. We have to do this because the computer only takes angles between 0 and 360 degrees. So if an angle goes from 359 to 360, instead of going to 361, it would drop all the way to 1. And instead of going from 1 to 0, instead of going to negative 1, it would go to 369. That causes these huge drops and jumps as shown in the bottom left graph. But when we unwrap, we expand the domain of angles that can be in the computer, so we get this clean sine wave on the bottom right. Next, we did fast Fourier transform, or FFT. This is basically a check to make sure that we're doing everything right. So this converts the data into a frequency versus magnitude graph. And as you can see on the left side, this is just from our simple sinusoidal movement data. So there's just a clear peak of 0.5 hertz. But on the right, this is from our human data. So there's a lot more noise, but still you can see a clear peak around 0.2, and that is our subject breathing.
Okay, for our sixth experiment, we tried to classify between locomotion and sedentary data. So I'd like all of you to know that we did do this entire experiment, or we came up with the experiment process by ourselves. And so what we did was we tried to set up an experiment where the human subject, which was one of our mentors, they would move between two chairs while the radar is still running. So you can see on the right, we had two different ways to set up the chair. On the top, it was front to back, and then on the bottom, it was side to side. And so why we did this was pretty much to try and see the difference between locomotion and sedentary behavior. And then we wanted to see how the movement affects the data in our charts. And we wanted to do this because most of our data was controlled, or they were just sitting and not moving.
So this is kind of the matrix that we used to check our data. As you can see, we had 6 different trials, and there are 3 different variables that went into this experiment. So number 1 was the breathing rate. Again, like our previous experiment, we used a metronome app to track that. So there was 14 beats per minute and 16 beats per minute. And like Quintin said before this slide, the chairs were in either one of 2 positions. Number 1 is side to side, or number 2 is back to back. and the chairs were at various different distances, the lowest being 0.5 meters apart, and the highest being 1.5 meters apart.
So in order to differentiate between locomotion and sedentary data, first we took the entire set of data, and then we did our normal post-processing using arctangent demodulation. Then we got our arctangent values, and then we segmented them into 2-second intervals. Then using each interval, we took the standard deviation, and if it was higher than a certain threshold, that meant that there's a lot of variation, meaning lots of movement, and then we would cut those out. So on the bottom, there's charge of either skew. On the left side of both, then there's a lot of mess, but on the right, there's more of a clean arc.
So the graph on the top represents our experiment where the big kind of spike in the middle, that's where our subject is moving from chair 1 to chair number 2. And the graph on the bottom left is basically an unfiltered graph, where all the elements come together to form one cohesive graph. So basically that's the breathing rate, that's the movement, and maybe some outside signals all into one graph. However, when we filter that graph, we get the graph on the bottom right. That one is where the movement from chair 1 to chair number 2 is filtered out, and any outside signals are also filtered out, so that way only the breathing rate is shown. So the big kind of spike towards the beginning of the graph, that's when our subject is inhaling and exhaling.
This is the results from when the subject moved from a front chair to a back chair, as opposed to the previous slide, which was when the subject moved from side to side. As you can see in the top right, this is our process graph of everything, including locomotion. As you can see, there's a big spike in the middle, which is when the subject moved. On the top right is our FFT of the full experiment with locomotion. As you can see, there's a lot of noise, and you can't tell how the subject is breathing. On the bottom left is our algorithm, is when we use the algorithm to cut out movement, and this was before the movement. So as you can see, there's a big peak where the subject was breathing around 0.2 or 0.3 hertz. On the bottom right, the peak is less clear. This is because our algorithm wasn't the best, so there was still some noise left over.
And then going on to just some conclusions for this experiment, once again, our goal was just to differentiate between locomotion and sedentary behaviors in our subject using radar. And one conclusion that we found is that it does work better for the side-to-side data sets compared to the front-to-back data sets. And we think that this must be because for the front-to-back data sets, the subject would be moving from the front chair to the back chair, and they would be getting farther away from our radar, and that would possibly make some discrepancies in our data. Another point that we discovered is that there were some issues with our deviation program, cleanly cutting off the ends of the movement. That was probably because of just some imprecise calculations with our program. But mostly we found that our deviation program was more on the successful side. And just for some future works and the importance of this experiment, the reason that we did this is that because people are constantly moving, and we need to, for viable systems they must be robust enough to classify and be able to recognize when a subject is moving around. And in the future, we want to be able to differentiate between normal movements versus actual medical emergencies. And this is important because on our graphs, they do look quite similar, being very just erratic and messy graphs.
Okay, so some problems that we encountered within our 6 weeks in this internship would be that we would get some bad data sets or some messy graphs. So on the top right, you can see an example of a good graph, and then on the bottom, you can see Godzilla shooting a laser beam out of our graph. So that would be a good example of something that we wouldn't want. But yeah, we did get a lot of those, and we would just have to work around it. And some other issues would be our mover. Sometimes we'd have a hard time starting it up, so that would take time away from us getting more data collected. And then also our distance wasn't always consistent with the mover, so that would kind of interfere with our data collection too. And lastly, there's some different torso shapes that were mentioned, like the spheres, and then our mock torso.
Here's some problems that we encountered with coding. So as we were doing circle fitting, it couldn't take in certain amplitudes below a certain point. So for example, as you can see, we have data for a 0.6 centimeter amplitude movement versus a 0.8 centimeter amplitude movement. With the 0.6 centimeter amplitude, the smaller the amplitude, the smaller the arc is on the I versus U graph. And if the arc is too small, it just looks like a straight line. So the computer interprets the circle as being way huger, as way more big than it really is. So as you can see, the dimensions for the circle for the 0.6 centimeter amplitude are on the tens of thousands, while for the 0.8 centimeter amplitude, it's on the scale of less than 1. Also, for our locomotion experiment, like I mentioned earlier, our algorithm was unable to isolate movement for certain periods.
So in terms of takeaways and conclusions for our lab, throughout the 6-week period, we learned various different things. So number 1 was programming for our post-processing data and data collection. We learned how to use Python as well as some software such as VS Code and Google Collaboratory. We also learned how the Doppler effect affects different radars. We learned how human movement also affects the data that we get from radars. And we also learned the different types of graphs that are produced from our experiments. And like anyone and anything in life, there are always rooms for improvement and future iterations. And in terms of our lab, number 1, we can organize our code better, so that way if someone were to continue this experiment in the future, maybe we can add more comments or define more functions to make it easier to read and use. We can also create a more precise testing environment, so this means more precise measurements between all of our elements, or maybe less noise from outside influences.
And then just some acknowledgements. So we'd like to thank the College of Engineering for giving us this opportunity, the Jesse ESAs for tolerating us throughout this entire experience, the fellow Jesse interns for motivating us and just being fun people to be around, Samira and Shadman for mentoring us throughout our lab, and our family and you, our